Greetings and welcome to Raven's Roost Forge. I'm your host Tate, and today we're going to be forging our first project, a coal rake. Okay, let's get started. So we're just going to go ahead and get that forge lit up, get it started by balling a little paper in there, lighting that on fire, and then we're going to get a little air going in order to get that charcoal lit. As you can see, I still have the remnants of a previous fire in there. I didn't bother to clean out the old charcoal, so there's still a little ash in the bottom, but it's working just fine. So for this project I used 1/2 inch or 12 mil rebar, and this is a little more than 2 feet or something like 60 centimeters worth. I have pretty mixed feelings on using rebar for projects. On the one hand, it's cheap and easy to get a hold of. On the other hand, since it's made to meet minimum specifications rather than out of a specific type of steel, it can be kind of a mystery sometimes what it is. And it can be a little hard to work under the hammer. It may not move very well, and it can even be quench hardenable to a certain extent sometimes. The fact that sometimes it can be quenched and hardened means that if you try to cool it off while you're working on it by dunking it in the water, you may end up cracking it. So what I'm trying to do during this first heat is isolate about 3 inches of material. This will later make the rake end of our coal rake. What I'm going to do here is actually form a shoulder, a two-sided shoulder, by turning the bar 90 degrees and working it at the same spot on the edge of the anvil. Make sure you take your time and you register the shoulder at the edge of the anvil every blow. Otherwise, you may end up with a series of steps instead of a clean shoulder. So here you can see the shoulder. It's not deep, but it's clean and crisp. In the next heat, we're going to start necking down that shoulder and then working down the rest of the material behind it. It should be mentioned that when you are forging down a bar, the most effective way to forge it is in a square cross-section. This is true even if the bar starts and ends round. I'd also like to point out that I'm not moving metal as effectively as I could. If I raised the hammer higher and incorporated more shoulder motion, I'd get a more effective swing. Okay, here you can see I've deepened that shoulder a little and just started drawing it down. Since the first project is a coal rake, I'm just using a shorter bit of rebar as a rake temporarily. You'll notice that I switch between hammering with my right and left hand throughout this video. That is mainly to give my painful right shoulder a little bit of a break now and then. So you'll see in these next few heats that all I'm doing is drawing down the material to thin it, reducing the weight, and I'm going to be forging in a gradual taper to make it a little more graceful. Fire management is a frequently overlooked part of blacksmithing. It's a good idea to keep your fire contained by cooling down the coals around the edge so you don't end up wasting fuel. I've sped up most of the drawing down, but here I've slowed it down in order to show you the fullering blow that I'm using in order to try to move material a little more aggressively. I'm still using a little bit of a light swing though. I probably would have been better off using a heavier blow. Here you can see that I was letting the fire get a little bit out of control. That's a way bigger fire than I need for this little piece of metal. As you can see, forging down a long taper on a tough piece of steel like rebar ends up being a big chore sometimes. I definitely recommend that if you're able to get 1/2 inch mild steel instead of rebar, that you take advantage of it because it's a lot easier to move under the hammer. It's worth noting that forging down the long taper like this is great practice, but it's not exactly necessary. If you just want a functioning tool, you can leave it full thickness. It's just going to end up being a lot heavier and it'll look a lot crummier. It's kind of amusing. It looks like I've forged away the whole day and it's now the middle of the night. But I was just forging at the end of the day, so you can see it got dark on me. I live in a neighborhood, so I don't like to forge very late. I packed it in after that last heat and then started up again another day. It took me way too long to get here, but I finally realized that if I put some fire bricks in to form a trough, then I won't waste as much charcoal and I'll be able to create a deeper, more effective fire. This actually worked a lot better, and so I recommend that if you're able to do so with a forge like this, that you use fire bricks to create a trough fire as well. I wanted to put a word in on fuel consumption. I heat treated the anvil, I made this rake, I made a pair of tongs, and I made a blacksmith knife, and all told I ended up using about a bag and a half or 45 pounds of charcoal. Once I started using the trough method, then my charcoal consumption rate went down quite a bit. So this is one of the final heats for that long taper. I'm basically straightening. I'm adding a chamfer to the edges to make it look a little nicer. And then I'm going to be working it down to a black heat in order to planish the finish. And planishing is basically like forge polishing. You use a low heat with light blows. You're not trying to forge. You're just trying to get a good surface finish. Working at low heats like this also are a good way to help get some of the fire scale to break off of the piece. My little slack tub is not quite deep enough to actually cool this whole thing off, so you'll every once in a while see me using a cup of water pouring over it to make sure it's cool. In hindsight, I think the final product would have benefited from extending that taper about 2 to 3 inches. So I just went into the main workshop to cut off the excess material. You have to figure out how much of a handle you need on there. I'm using a folded over handle, so basically you want to figure out how long you want the handle and then double the amount of material so that you can fold it over on itself. I usually like tool handles to have a 4 to 5 inch handle, and so that means 8 to 10 inches of material. That would be 20 to 25 centimeters. This is just your basic bimetal hacksaw that I'm using to cut it. I add a little bit of wax to the blade so that when it heats up during the cut, it will kind of lubricate the cut. Since I'm going to be forging kind of a fishtail on the end of this, then I wanted to make sure that it was filed to a nice bevel and all of the burrs and jagged edges were cleaned up. Here you can kind of see what that trough fire looks like a little more close up in practice. It produces a more compact, deeper fire that reduces oxidation and saves fuel. In the next few heats, I'm going to be making the rake tine. So here I'm just putting a flat on that material that we isolated previously. And then in the next heat, I'm going to be using the peen to start widening that. So in this heat, you'll see that I'm using the cross peen in order to forge that tine nice and wide and thin it out at the same time. I don't want to increase the length, I want to increase the width, and the cross peen is the tool to do that. This process leaves divots in the material that will later need to be forged out. As you can see, by the end of each heat, we've made it a little wider and a little thinner. It's a good idea to avoid deforming the shape too much during this process, so periodically turn the tine up on its edge and use the flat of the hammer to maintain the rectangular shape. Ultimately, this rake tine is going to have a thicker spine and a thinner edge, similar to forging a knife. So this is actually good practice for forging the bevels of a knife edge. To do this, you tilt the hammer so that the handle side of the face is slightly lower than the top side. This creates a wedge shape between the anvil face and the hammer. Angling your hammer is really the only way to taper a surface. So the tine is the correct shape and thickness. Now we just got to cool it off for the next operation. You can see here that if done properly, you get that perfect knife edge shape. A pointed tip can be a useful feature on a coal rake. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cut a notch about halfway through the width of the material, about a 1/4 inch from the edge, and then I'm going to forge that into a little point. So in order to make that into a point, what we've got to do is use the corner of the anvil to widen that notch a little bit. And then you want to take that tab that we've just created and put it right on the edge of the anvil and essentially fold it out to start the point. It's going to want to twist on you, so you want to make sure that you go slow and not allow that to happen too badly. Okay, you'll see in just a moment here how I've taken that notch and flattened it into a tab. Now we just have to take that little tab and taper it down into a small point. Be careful, don't wail on it. It's a small amount of material and you can mangle it pretty easily. So I've just forged that tab down into a small blunt point. Next we're going to cool off that tip a little bit so that we don't mangle it. And then we're going to start bending the tine in order to form a bit of a hook. Forming that kind of L shape into the tine will allow this tool to be good for pulling and pushing coals away from you. It's perfectly serviceable as is, but in order to make it a little more elegant, I'm forming a bit of a recurve into the tip so that it has a nicer look and shape. I'm not only using the face of the anvil here, I'm also using the sides as work surfaces as well. Don't forget that you can use any part of the anvil that you need. One final look to see if the shape is right, and that looks good. And then we're going to take a wire brush and try to knock off as much scale as we can. It's a new day and we're just going to use files to refine the shape of that rake tine, clean it up, and remove any burrs. I use a 3/8 round file and a half round file for this purpose. Don't be afraid to refine your work a little bit with files, especially when you're just learning to forge. You'll end up with a much nicer product if you do that. Again, you could have skipped this step and still have a perfectly serviceable tool, but taking 5 to 10 minutes to clean it up with a file will make it look much nicer, and you can end up with a tool that you could be much more proud of. Okay, the next thing we need to do is work on the handle. So I'm going to forge a short blunt taper into the handle portion, and I'm going to allow it to spread naturally. This will form kind of a fishtail shape. You want to do your best to make sure that the fishtail you're creating is parallel to the tine. You don't want to introduce a bad twist in there that you'll have to get out later. Now you can see what I'm talking about when I say fishtail. It's just a blunt taper on the end of a bar that's allowed to spread naturally. I tried to be careful, but I still ended up with a slight twist between the tine and the taper. So I'm just using a pair of pliers to try to take that twist out. If it's a small enough twist on a thin enough bar, you can do it this way, but your best bet is to put it in the vise and use something like a pipe wrench to twist it. Okay, so we're just gonna clean it off again best we can with a wire brush. So we're just gonna pop back into the workshop for a moment and then use a file to clean up that fishtail just like we did with the tine earlier. Cleaning up the fishtail now before we curve the handle will make this whole process a lot easier. Even if you didn't decide to deburr and clean up the tine, you want to make sure you do so with the fishtail because it's going to be up against your fingers when you're holding the handle. Next, we're going to form a little curve into the fishtail that will act as a little stop for your fingers. Don't forget that we're going to be folding this handle back on itself later, so think through which direction you're going to put that curve in. You can see that you want that curve to go the opposite way of the tine so that when you fold it over, it can act as a finger guard. So we're going to cool off the end of that bar a little bit so that we don't risk mangling it while we fold over the handle. Now remember, we're trying to bend this, not forge it, so you want to use bending blows. You can see that I've formed a gentle curve. Be easy with it. You don't want to put a kink in it. Take your time when you're forming curves in forged work, because if you get a kink in there, it's going to be pretty hard to get it out. It's worth noting that the likeliest place to get a kink is where the material is thin or non-uniform. Now the handle's folded back on itself nicely, but I ended up with a little twist, so I'm trying to take that out. Here I'm trying to tap everything back into alignment so the handle's lined up nicely with the rest of the rake. There was a little too much twist to get out with just the pliers, so I heated up the area near the tine, put it in the vise, and then gave it a little twist to tweak everything into alignment. And then after cooling everything off, one last little cleanup with the file so that it's comfortable against the hand. And then one final thorough cleanup with the wire brush, and then we'll put a finish on it. I'll be applying paste wax as a finish, and then burning it on. This will leave a nice black luster that is pretty tough. In order to do this finish, we want to heat up the area we're going to finish to about 450 to 500 degrees and then apply the wax. You can see here by the amount of smoke that it's a little too hot. You want it to smoke lightly, and you want to be able to see the wax turn black over the course of a few moments after you apply it. Make sure you do this in a well-ventilated area and wear a respirator if you can't keep your head out of the smoke plume. Here's the final product, and I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. It works well and it's comfortable in the hand. The only gripe I have is that I should have made it just a little bit longer to keep my hand away from the fire, but it hasn't been a problem so far. And finally, some action shots. You can see it works great for wrangling those hot coals. And when you're cleaning out the fire pot at the end of the day, the little pointy bit is great for cleaning out the grates. That pointy bit's also good for breaking up coal that sticks together if you're using coal in your forge. So I hope you enjoyed the video and you learned something. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Happy forging, and I'll see you next time.